James Riddle Hoffa was born in 1913 in the small coal mining town of Brazil, Indiana. It was a hard place to grow up. His father worked in the mines. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and unforgiving. When Jimmy was just 7 years old, his father died of lung disease, another casualty of a job that offered little mercy. His mother moved the family north to Detroit, chasing steadier work in a city that promised opportunity. Detroit in the 1920s was booming. Automobiles were transforming the country, and factories pulsed with the rhythm of industry. But for working families, prosperity was rarely simple. Jimmy left school at 14. Like many boys of his generation, he went straight to work. He loaded and unloaded produce in a grocery warehouse. The hours were long. The pay was low. The supervisors demanded speed and silence. It was here, on the loading docks, that Jimmy Hoffa discovered something about himself. He did not scare easily. One afternoon, workers were told to handle a shipment of strawberries that were beginning to rot. The job was unpleasant and rushed. Hoffa saw an opportunity. He quietly persuaded his fellow workers to slow down, to refuse the extra burden unless they were paid fairly. It was a small act of defiance. But it worked. Management relented. For the young Hoffa, it was a revelation. Power did not always belong to the boss. Sometimes it belonged to the men who stood shoulder to shoulder. By his early 20s, Hoffa had joined the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a union representing truck drivers and warehouse workers. At the time, the Teamsters were growing, but they were still fragmented, local, uneven in strength. Hoffa possessed a rare combination of qualities. He was disciplined, tireless. He had a sharp memory for names and grievances. He could talk plainly to workers who distrusted polished speeches. And he understood something fundamental. Organization was leverage. The Great Depression deepened the urgency of labor organizing. Jobs vanished overnight. Wages dropped. Fear became a constant companion. In that climate, Hoffa did not present himself as a dreamer. He presented himself as a fighter. Archival footage shows him walking briskly, jaw set, eyes focused. He was not tall. He was not glamorous. But he radiated determination. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Hoffa helped orchestrate strikes that were disciplined and strategic. He believed in preparation. He studied delivery routes, supply chains, the quiet vulnerabilities of companies that depended on timely shipments. If trucks stopped moving, businesses felt it quickly, and Hoffa knew exactly where to apply pressure. By 1952, at just 39 years old, he had risen to become vice president of the Teamsters Union. 5 years later, he would assume the presidency. Under his leadership, the union expanded dramatically. Membership surged into the hundreds of thousands, and eventually into the millions. Truck drivers, warehousemen, freight handlers. Hoffa brought them together under a unified national contract. One of his most significant achievements came in 1964, the National Master Freight Agreement. It standardized wages and benefits for truckers across the country. For many working families, it meant stable income, health care, and a pension they could count on. To his supporters, Hoffa was a champion of the American worker. He delivered tangible results. He demanded respect for men who had often been overlooked. But power on that scale does not grow quietly. As the Teamsters' influence expanded, so did the union's financial resources, particularly its pension fund. Billions of dollars flowed through its accounts. With that money came opportunity and temptation. Hoffa insisted that he was building security for his members. Critics wondered who else might benefit from such vast sums. By the late 1950s, Hoffa was no longer just a labor leader. He was a national figure. He appeared in headlines. He testified before Congress. He sparred publicly with political leaders who viewed him as both formidable and dangerous. Yet even in the glare of national attention, Hoffa remained intensely practical. He rose early. He worked constantly. He kept meticulous track of internal union politics. Loyalty mattered deeply to him, and disloyalty was not easily forgiven. Those who worked alongside him often described a man who remembered favors and slights. He believed the labor movement required strength, not politeness, not compromise for its own sake. Strength. And he was willing to confront anyone who stood in his path. The camera lingers on a photograph of Hoffa addressing a crowded union hall. The room is thick with cigarette smoke. Faces look upward with expectation. For many workers, he was more than an administrator. He was proof that someone from their world could command the national stage. But influence of that magnitude does not exist in isolation. As the Teamsters grew, so did federal scrutiny. Rumors circulated about alliances forged in back rooms. Questions arose about the union's connections to organized crime. Hoffa dismissed many of the accusations as political attacks. He maintained that his sole purpose was strengthening the union. Still, the spotlight intensified. By the early 1960s, he had become one of the most controversial men in America, admired by many, distrusted by others, and watched closely by the federal government. What began on a warehouse dock in Detroit had evolved into a power base that stretched across the nation's highways. Jimmy Hoffa had mastered the art of leverage. He understood how to move freight, how to move men, how to move money. And perhaps most importantly, how to move outcomes. But power, once accumulated, rarely goes unchallenged. As Hoffa's influence reached its peak, forces were gathering that would test him in ways he could not fully control. The question was no longer whether Jimmy Hoffa was powerful. The question was whether that power had made him untouchable, or whether it had placed a target squarely on his back. By the late 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa was no longer simply a union leader from Detroit. He was a national figure, admired by many working men, but viewed with deep suspicion in Washington. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters had grown into the largest and most powerful labor union in America. With that power came something else: money. A great deal of it. The Teamsters Central States Pension Fund held hundreds of millions of dollars retirement savings belonging to truck drivers and warehouse workers across the country. It was meant to secure their futures, but it also became one of the most formidable pools of capital in the nation. That money did not sit idle. Loans from the Yasti pension fund financed hotels and casinos in Las Vegas. They supported construction projects in cities far from Detroit. Developers who struggled to secure traditional financing found an eager partner in the Teamsters Fund. To some, this was savvy investment strategy. To others, it raised troubling questions, because many of those projects were connected directly or indirectly to organized crime figures. The line between business opportunity and criminal enterprise was not always clear. Las Vegas in the 1950s and 1960s was expanding rapidly. Casinos rose from the desert, glittering with promise. But behind the neon lights stood men whose reputations were far from polished. Federal investigators began to suspect that organized crime families were using union pension loans to build and expand their interests. If that was true, it would mean that American workers' retirement funds were entangled in something far darker. Hoffa denied wrongdoing. He argued that the loans were sound, profitable, and beneficial to union members. He insisted that he did not ask about a borrower's social circle, only about their ability to repay. But in Washington, skepticism hardened. In 1957, the Senate established the Select Committee on Improper Activities in the Labor or Management Field. It was a mouthful of a title, but its purpose was direct: Investigate corruption in American labor unions. One of the committee's most relentless questioners was a young, ambitious attorney named Robert F. Kennedy. Kennedy was sharp, methodical, and unyielding. He believed that organized crime had infiltrated major labor unions, and that Jimmy Hoffa stood at the center of that infiltration. The hearings were televised. Americans watched as Hoffa and Kennedy faced each other across the table. Their exchanges were tense, sometimes openly hostile. Kennedy pressed Hoffa about pension fund loans, about associations, about alleged favors. Hoffa responded with confidence, occasionally with irritation. He accused the committee of conducting a political witch hunt. The rivalry quickly became personal. Kennedy viewed Hoffa as emblematic of corruption in labor leadership. Hoffa saw Kennedy as an ambitious prosecutor seeking headlines. Neither man backed down. Behind the scenes, the federal government intensified its efforts. Investigators followed financial trails. Informants were cultivated. Surveillance expanded. For Hoffa, the scrutiny was constant, but he did not retreat. He traveled the country, addressing union halls packed with members who cheered his name. To them, he was not a criminal mastermind. He was the man who secured their contracts, who ensured that trucks moved under fair terms. In private, Hoffa was pragmatic. He understood that the trucking industry did not operate in isolation. Routes crossed cities controlled by various interests. Strikes required coordination. Stability sometimes depended on uneasy understandings. Was he collaborating with organized crime or simply navigating the realities of mid-century American commerce? That question remains at the heart of his legacy. There is little doubt that certain organized crime figures held influence in industries tied to trucking and construction. There is also little doubt that Hoffa, as head of the Teamsters, interacted with powerful men whose reputations were complicated at best. But interaction is not confession, and association is not always conspiracy. Still, prosecutors believed they could prove more. The pension fund became a focal point. Billions of dollars, by today's standards, moved through its accounts over time. Loans were approved by trustees who were often loyal to Hoffa. Critics argued that safeguards were weak. Supporters countered that the investments generated returns. Meanwhile, the public image of Jimmy Hoffa shifted. No longer just the determined labor organizer from Detroit, he became a symbol of something murkier, of smoke-filled rooms and whispered agreements. Newspaper headlines linked his name with phrases like racketeering and mob influence. Whether fully substantiated or not, the perception began to take hold. And perception, in politics, can be as powerful as proof. By the early 1960s, the feud between Hoffa and Robert Kennedy had escalated beyond professional disagreement. When Kennedy became Attorney General under his brother, President John F. Kennedy, the Department of Justice intensified its campaign. Hoffa would later claim that he was the target of an obsessive vendetta. Kennedy maintained that he was enforcing the law. The conflict reflected a broader struggle within America at the time, a country wrestling with questions about power, corruption, and accountability. Labor unions had delivered unprecedented gains for working families. But their growing influence also raised concerns. Who watched the watchdogs? Who ensured transparency in organizations that wielded such economic force? Hoffa remained defiant. He testified repeatedly. He sparred with investigators. He projected confidence, even when pressure mounted. Yet with every hearing, every headline, the circle tightened. Some of Hoffa's allies grew uneasy. Political winds were shifting. The federal government had expanded its reach. Organized crime investigations were becoming more sophisticated. If Hoffa had forged alliances in the shadows, those shadows were growing thinner. And perhaps the most dangerous position in America was to stand at the intersection of organized labor, organized crime, and federal ambition. By 1964, prosecutors believed they finally had their case. The man who had risen from a grocery warehouse to command the nation's largest union now faced the full force of the United States government. The hearings had been only the beginning. The real battle was about to move from the Senate chamber to the courtroom. By 1964, the long struggle between Jimmy Hoffa and the federal government had reached its decisive moment. For years, investigators had tried to build a case strong enough to withstand his denials. That year, they succeeded. In separate trials, Hoffa was convicted first for jury tampering, then for fraud involving misuse of union pension funds. The charges were serious. The sentences were substantial. Together, they added up to 13 years in federal prison. Hoffa appealed, as many in his position would, but the appeals failed. In 1967, he began serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, for a man who had spent decades commanding packed union halls and negotiating national contracts. Prison was a stark reversal. Gone were the motorcades and microphones. In their place, concrete walls, metal bars, and a rigid daily routine. But even behind bars, Jimmy Hoffa did not fade quietly. He read constantly. He wrote letters. He remained in communication with trusted allies. Visitors carried news from the outside world, updates on union leadership, shifting loyalties, political developments. He had built his life around control. Prison stripped much of that away. Yet it did not extinguish his ambition. At the time of his incarceration, Hoffa had been succeeded as president of the Teamsters by Frank Fitzsimmons, a man widely viewed as more accommodating, less combative. Fitzsimmons projected calm. He maintained relationships with political leaders. He kept the machinery of the union running smoothly. Some observers believed the transition signaled a new chapter, one less turbulent, less controversial, but Hoffa saw it differently. From his prison cell, he followed union politics closely. He heard rumors that decisions were being made without him. That influence he once commanded was settling into new hands. For Hoffa, the presidency of the Teamsters was not simply a job. It was his life's work. He believed he had built the union into a national force, and he did not intend to surrender it permanently. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, America was changing. The late 1960s were marked by unrest, civil rights marches, anti-war protests, political assassinations. Public trust in institutions was shifting. Labor unions still held power, but they faced new pressures. And in Washington, a new administration had taken office. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected President of the United States. Nixon had long maintained a complex relationship with organized labor. He understood its political influence. He also understood the value of strategic alliances. By 1971, Hoffa had served less than 5 years of his 13-year sentence when an unexpected development occurred. President Richard Nixon granted Jimmy Hoffa a commutation of sentence. The decision was controversial. A commutation is not a pardon. It reduces a sentence, but does not erase the conviction. Hoffa would be free, but not fully restored. There was a condition attached. Hoffa was barred from participating in union activities until 1980. The restriction was clear. He could not seek office, could not directly involve himself in the affairs of the Teamsters. For some, this seemed a reasonable compromise. Hoffa would regain his freedom, but the union could move forward without renewed turmoil. For Hoffa, the condition was intolerable. He left prison in December 1971 to a crowd of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed as he stepped into the winter air, a free man once more. He smiled. He spoke confidently. He declared his intention to return to leadership. Almost immediately, he began challenging the restriction. He argued that the ban was unjust. possibly even unconstitutional. His attorneys filed motions seeking to overturn it. Hoffa insisted that his members wanted him back, that he had unfinished business. But the world he re-entered was not the same one he had left. During his imprisonment, the Teamsters' leadership had stabilized under Fitzsimmons. Relationships had formed, arrangements political and otherwise had taken root. Many within the Union were wary of reopening old battles. There were also others watching closely. Federal officials monitored Hoffa's movements. Organized crime figures, some of whom had allegedly maintained connections to the Union, had adapted to new leadership structures. Hoffa's return threatened to disrupt a delicate balance. Yet he pressed forward. He traveled. He met quietly with supporters. He began building what looked very much like a campaign for reinstatement. Those closest to him later said he felt energized, almost reborn by the fight. Prison had not humbled him. It had hardened his resolve. He believed he had been wronged. He believed he could reclaim what was his. But reclaiming power is rarely simple. It requires allies. It requires leverage. And it often requires confronting those who have grown accustomed to authority. In interviews from the early 1970s, Hoffa appears focused, even impatient. He speaks about loyalty, about promises made, about justice. He also seems aware that time is not unlimited. The restriction ran until 1980. That was nearly a decade away. Hoffa was in his late 50s. Waiting was not in his nature. He began seeking support from figures who could help remove the ban. Political connections were explored. Legal strategies were pursued, but every effort met resistance. Some within organized. Crime circles reportedly opposed his return, preferring the predictability of the current leadership. Others within the Union feared renewed federal scrutiny if Hoffa reclaimed the presidency. In pushing for reinstatement, Hoffa was not just challenging a legal condition. He was challenging a web of interests that had adjusted to life without him. And still, he moved forward. He spoke confidently to friends about meetings that would clear the path, conversations that would settle disputes, understandings that would smooth the way back. He believed he could negotiate his return, just as he had negotiated contracts on the loading docks decades earlier. But this time, the stakes were higher. This time, the conversations would not take place in crowded Union halls or Senate chambers. They would unfold quietly, among men who preferred privacy. By the summer of 1975, Jimmy Hoffa was still fighting to regain control of the Union he had once ruled. He had survived prison. He had regained his freedom. He had defied prosecutors and outlasted political adversaries. Now, he stood on the threshold of what he believed would be his restoration. What he could not know was that the effort to reclaim his power would lead him to a suburban parking lot and into history's most enduring disappearance. July 30th, 1975, it was a warm Wednesday in Bloomfield Township, a comfortable suburb north of Detroit, the kind of place where business lunches unfolded without fanfare, where parking lots rarely attracted attention. For Jimmy Hoffa, it was supposed to be a routine meeting. He told his wife, Josephine, that he was going to meet two men for lunch at a restaurant called the Macus Red Fox. The meeting, he said, was important. It involved individuals who could help resolve the resistance to his return to Union leadership. The names he mentioned were significant. One was Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a powerful figure in Detroit organized crime circles. The other was Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Union official with known mob connections. These were not casual acquaintances. They were men with influence. Hoffa believed they could help clear obstacles. Or perhaps he believed they needed convincing. Shortly before 1 p.m., he left his home in Lake Orion and drove alone in his green 1974 Pontiac Grandville. He arrived at the restaurant parking. Lot just before 2 p.m., the Machu's Red Fox was a popular spot white tablecloths, polished wood, the sort of establishment where businessmen felt comfortable conducting quiet negotiations. But that afternoon, something was already off. Hoffa waited in his car. Witnesses later recalled seeing him pacing near the vehicle, checking his watch, appearing irritated. At approximately 2:15 p.m., he placed a phone call to his wife from a pay phone outside the restaurant. He told her he had been stood up. "They haven't shown up yet," he reportedly said, frustration in his voice. Josephine suggested he come home. Hoffa told her he would wait a few more minutes. It would be the last confirmed conversation anyone had with him. The parking lot was not deserted. Other patrons arrived and departed. Employees moved between the building and their cars. Yet no one reported seeing a confrontation. No struggle. No raised voices. Some witnesses later claimed they saw Hoffa speaking with one or more men near a maroon car. Others remembered only that he seemed agitated. The details blurred almost immediately. Sometime between 2:30 and 2:45 p.m., Jimmy Hoffa vanished. His car remained in the parking lot. The keys were gone. There were no signs of violence. No broken glass. No blood. Just an empty vehicle under the summer sun. When Hoffa failed to return home that evening, Josephine grew worried. It was unlike him not to call. Unlike him not to account for his whereabouts. By nightfall, family members began contacting hospitals. Then police. Within days, the disappearance became national news. The former president of the Teamsters, one of the most recognizable labor figures in America, had vanished without a trace. Investigators moved quickly. They examined the Pontiac. They dusted for fingerprints. They interviewed restaurant staff and patrons. They questioned Giacoloni and Provenzano. Both men denied meeting Hoffa that day. Both claimed they had other engagements. No physical evidence placed either of them in the parking lot. As the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, a realization began to settle in. Jimmy Hoffa had not simply missed an appointment. He had been removed. Question was how. One prevailing theory suggested he was lured into another vehicle, perhaps by someone he trusted. There were indications that he might have gotten into a maroon Mercury parked nearby. Witness accounts, however, were inconsistent. Some said they saw him enter a car willingly. Others insisted they saw nothing at all. The FBI soon took the lead. Agents canvassed the area. They reconstructed timelines. They examined toll booth records, telephone logs, and known associates. But the trail cooled almost immediately. There were no confirmed sightings after that afternoon. No ransom demand. No credible communication. For a man as high profile as Hoffa, the silence was startling. Speculation spread quickly. Had he been killed within hours of entering another vehicle? Was he transported to a secondary location? Was his body buried or destroyed? Authorities explored every possibility. They searched nearby fields and wooded areas. They investigated warehouses and garages. Informants whispered about incinerators, about industrial compactors, about remote farmland. But whispers are not proof. The Machu's Red Fox parking lot became a symbol, an ordinary space transformed by absence. Reporters returned repeatedly, photographing the stretch of asphalt where Hoffa's car had sat. It looked unchanged. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. Life had continued. Customers dined. Cars parked and departed. Only one man had failed to come back. In the weeks that followed, federal investigators interviewed dozens of individuals connected to Detroit and New Jersey crime families. Some were evasive. Some invoked their constitutional rights. None provided definitive answers. Joe Colon was questioned extensively. So was Provenzano. Both maintained their innocence. Without a body, prosecutors faced a challenge. Without physical evidence, suspicions remained just that suspicions dot as the summer faded into autumn. Hope of finding Hoffa alive diminished. Privately, many investigators concluded that he had been killed on the day he disappeared. The efficiency suggested planning. The lack of evidence suggested experience. If this was an execution, it had been carried out with precision. The man who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of truck drivers had stepped into a meeting he believed would restore his power. Instead, he stepped into silence. The final confirmed image of Jimmy Hoffa is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is simply a man waiting in a parking lot, glancing at his watch, expecting others to arrive. Perhaps he sensed something was wrong. Perhaps he believed he could still negotiate his way through it. What remains certain is this: between one phone call and the passing of a few ordinary minutes, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. From the visible world. No body has ever been recovered. No court has ever convicted anyone of his murder. And that quiet suburban afternoon continues to echo across decades, an unfinished sentence in American history. The camera lingers on an empty parking space as evening light fades. Somewhere between frustration and fatal trust, Jimmy Hoffa walked toward his final unknown. And the answers, if they still exist, remain buried with him. When Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, investigators did not begin from scratch. They already had a list of names. For years, federal authorities had tracked the relationship between certain organized crime families and elements within the Teamsters union. They understood the power structure. They knew who influenced trucking routes, who held sway over pension fund loans, who settled disputes behind closed doors. And they believed Hoffa had stepped into that world one time too many. The first circle of suspicion centered on Detroit. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone was a respected, even feared, figure in local organized crime. Soft-spoken, careful, he rarely raised his voice. He rarely made mistakes in public. According to Hoffa's own account to his wife, Giacalone was one of the men he expected to meet that day at the Machu's Red Fox. Giacalone denied it. He said he had other appointments. He was cooperative in interviews, but firm. He had not seen Hoffa. Investigators could not place him in the parking lot. Then there was Anthony Provenzano, known as Tony Pro, a union official from New Jersey with documented ties to organized crime. Provenzano and Hoffa had once been allies. Later, they became adversaries. Their falling out had been serious. By some accounts, it was bitter. Provenzano also denied any involvement. He claimed he had not scheduled a meeting with Hoffa and was nowhere near Detroit that afternoon. The alibis held at least in court, but suspicion lingered. Federal authorities developed a theory. Hoffa's determination to reclaim the Teamsters presidency had alarmed powerful figures in organized crime. They had grown comfortable with the union's leadership under Frank Fitzsimmons. Stability meant predictable arrangements. Predictable arrangements meant profit. Hoffa's return threatened that balance. If he resumed control, he might shift alliances. He might disrupt financial flows. He might assert independence in ways that unsettled long-standing agreements. In that view, his disappearance was not impulsive. It was strategic, a message. Over the years, investigators identified other possible participants, men who might have lured Hoffa into a car, men who might have transported him to a secondary location, men who might have carried out the final act. Yet none of these theories produced the one element prosecutors needed most: a body. Without it, even the strongest suspicions remained circumstantial. Then, decades later, a new name rose to prominence. In 2003, a former union official named Frank Chiron claimed he had been involved in Hoffa's murder. Chiron's story was detailed. He said he had been a trusted associate of both Hoffa and organized crime figures. He described driving Hoffa to a house in suburban Detroit. He claimed he shot him there. He suggested the body was quickly cremated. The account gained widespread attention after it was published in the book I Heard You Paint Houses. For many Americans, the confession seemed to provide long-awaited closure. Sheeran spoke calmly. He described events with apparent certainty. He portrayed himself as a man carrying a burden of memory, but investigators were cautious. Some aspects of Sheeran's timeline conflicted with established records. Certain details could not be corroborated. When forensic teams examined the house he identified, they found no definitive evidence tying it to Hoffa's death. Critics argued that Sheeran may have exaggerated his role in various events throughout his life. Supporters countered that organized crime murders rarely leave neat forensic trails. The truth remained elusive. Over time, dozens of individuals, some credible, some less so, claimed knowledge of Hoffa's fate. A mob enforcer said the body was crushed in a car. Compactor. Another informant suggested it was buried beneath a barn. Still others insisted it had been transported out of state entirely. Each claim triggered renewed searches. Each search ended the same way: empty earth. One reason the case proved so resistant to resolution was the culture of silence surrounding organized crime. Loyalty was enforced not merely by tradition, but by fear. Those who spoke risked consequences. And yet, time changes loyalties. As years passed, aging figures began to talk, sometimes to settle scores, sometimes to sell books, sometimes to shape their legacy. The problem was consistency. Stories contradicted one another. Locations shifted. Timelines blurred. What one man described as certainty, another dismissed as fantasy. Investigators faced a troubling possibility. Perhaps too many people had been involved. Perhaps knowledge had been compartmentalized. Perhaps even those on the periphery did not know the full plan. One prevailing theory suggested that Hoffa was killed within hours of entering a vehicle on July 30th, 1975. His body, according to this view, was disposed of quickly, either through cremation or industrial destruction, precisely to prevent future prosecution. If there was no body, there would be no crime scene. If there was no crime scene, there would be no trial. It was a brutal calculus. And it may explain why, despite decades of investigation, no one has been convicted of Jimmy Hoffa's murder. The prime suspects aged. Some died in prison on unrelated charges. Others passed away quietly, never publicly confessing. With each death, potential first-hand knowledge faded. The FBI has repeatedly stated that it believes organized crime was responsible, but belief is not proof. For Hoffa's family, and for a nation that followed his rise and fall, the absence of resolution carries a particular weight. We know he met powerful men. We know he intended to reclaim his influence. We know he disappeared in broad daylight. What we do not know, what perhaps only a small circle ever truly knew, is who gave the final order. Was it a single decision made in anger? Was it a collective agreement reached in quiet calculation? Or was it a chain of events that spiraled beyond any one person's control? The faces of the prime suspects now belong to history, captured in faded photographs, preserved in court transcripts, remembered in rumors. They leave behind a question that refuses to settle. Did they silence Jimmy Hoffa to protect their interests? Or has the truth been obscured by decades of storytelling, misdirection, and myth? The camera lingers on old case files stacked high on a desk. Somewhere within those pages may lie fragments of the answer. But fragments are not closure. And so the list of prime suspects remains names etched into the margins of one of America's most enduring mysteries. When Jimmy Hoffa disappeared, The search began almost immediately. At first, it was urgent, personal, focused on the possibility, however, faint, that he might still be alive. Police canvassed neighborhoods near the Machu's Red Fox restaurant. They knocked on doors. They asked about unusual activity, strange vehicles, unfamiliar faces. Officers walked wooded areas and drainage ditches. Helicopters circled overhead, but as the days passed, the tone shifted. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a suspected homicide without a body. The Federal Bureau of Investigation took the lead. For years, agents followed leads across Michigan and beyond. They cultivated informants inside organized crime circles. They recorded conversations. They mapped relationships, and they dug. Again and again, they dug. In the months after Hoffa's disappearance, agents searched farmland in rural Michigan. They examined properties owned or frequented by individuals linked to organized crime. Each tip, no matter how improbable, was evaluated. Most led nowhere. In 1976, a year after Hoffa vanished, authorities conducted a widely publicized search of a Detroit area landfill. Informants had suggested his body might have been buried there. Heavy equipment tore into the earth. Reporters gathered at the perimeter. Nothing was found. Over time, the search expanded beyond Michigan. Rumors took on a life of their own. One persistent legend claimed Hoffa had been buried beneath Giant Stadium in New Jersey. The theory captured public imagination. It was repeated in newspapers, late-night monologues, and everyday conversation. There was never credible evidence to support it, yet the rumor endured, a testament to how deeply the mystery had entered American culture. Meanwhile, investigators pursued more grounded leads. They examined a property in Milford Township, Michigan, after an informant claimed Hoffa was buried beneath a horse stable. Agents dug carefully. Soil was sifted. Samples were tested. Again, nothing. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic technology offered renewed hope. Ground-penetrating radar allowed investigators to examine areas without disturbing large sections of land. Cadaver dogs were deployed in carefully selected sites. Each new technique carried promise. Each new excavation carried anticipation. And each one ended in disappointment. In 2006, the FBI searched a farm in southeastern Michigan after a man claimed his father had witnessed Hoffa's burial decades earlier. Agents excavated a portion of the property. Media coverage was intense. The nation watched. No remains were recovered. 5 years later, in 2012, another search focused on a suburban Detroit home. The property had once belonged to a relative of a suspected mob associate. Investigators tore up a driveway after receiving a tip. Beneath the concrete, they found only soil. In 2021, yet another excavation took place in a wooded area near a former landfill site in New Jersey. The search was prompted by information provided by a former mob figure before his death. Agents worked methodically. They documented each layer of earth. Once more, nothing. By then, nearly half a century had passed. Jimmy Hoffa had been declared legally dead in 1982, 7 years after his disappearance. The declaration brought a measure of legal closure for his family, but it did not resolve the mystery. What makes the searches so compelling is not simply their number, but their persistence. The FBI has described the Hoffa investigation as one of the longest-running cases in its history. Generations of agents have inherited the file. Some were not yet born when Hoffa vanished. Why continue? Because the absence of a body is not merely symbolic. In criminal law, it matters. It shapes what can be proven. It determines whether charges can be filed. And in this case, the absence feels deliberate. Many investigators believe Hoffa's killers understood precisely what they were doing. If the body were destroyed through cremation, industrial compaction, or chemical means, there would be no gravesite to uncover decades later. It would be In effect, a perfect disappearance, but perfection is rare. That is why each tip still draws attention. Even today, when a credible lead emerges, agents assess it carefully. The case file remains open. There is something almost haunting about the physical act of searching. Bulldozers, scraping away soil, agents standing silently as evidence teams sift through dirt. The slow, methodical hope that something, anything might surface. A button, a fragment of bone, a trace of clothing. So far, the earth has kept its secrets. For Hoffa's family, the lack of a gravesite means there is no place to visit, no marker to stand before. For investigators, it means the story remains unfinished. For the public, it reinforces the sense of something unresolved in the American narrative, a powerful man who vanished in broad daylight and left behind nothing tangible. In many ways, the searches tell their own story. They reflect the persistence of law enforcement. They reflect the enduring fascination of this public. And they reflect the possibility, however faint, that truth can surface, even after decades of silence. But as of today, no excavation has yielded definitive evidence of Jimmy Hoffa's fate. The fields have been turned, the driveways broken, the landfills combed. Still, the question remains beneath the surface. Somewhere, perhaps in an unremarkable patch of ground. Perhaps nowhere at all lies the final piece of the puzzle. Until it is found, the search continues. The camera pulls back from the empty field at dawn. The machinery powers down. The workers depart. The earth settles quietly once more. And the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa remains buried, whether in soil or only in memory. When evidence runs thin, theories begin to take shape. In the case of Jimmy Hoffa, the absence of a body has left space for speculation, for competing narratives, for explanations that attempt to bring order to a day that ended in silence. Over the decades, investigators, journalists, and former insiders have advanced several major theories. Some are dramatic, some are restrained. All attempt to answer the same question: why did Jimmy Hoffa disappear? The most widely accepted theory is also the most direct. It suggests that organized crime leaders ordered Hoffa's murder to prevent his return to power. By the summer of 1975, Hoffa had become a disruptive force. He was campaigning to reclaim leadership of the Teamsters. He was challenging existing arrangements. He was pressing for meetings with men who may have preferred stability over upheaval. From this perspective, Hoffa represented risk. If he regained control of the Union, he might alter pension fund relationships. He might revisit agreements made in his absence. He might expose understandings that others wished to keep quiet. In organized crime, unpredictability is a liability. The theory holds that Hoffa was summoned to a meeting under the pretense of negotiation. Once isolated, he was eliminated swiftly. His body was disposed of in a manner designed to leave no trace. It was not personal. In this view, it was business. A second theory shifts the focus slightly. It suggests that the threat did not come solely from traditional organized crime families, but from within the Union itself. By 1975, Frank Fitzsimmons had been leading the Teamsters for several years. He had built his own alliances. He had established his own authority. Hoffa's return would not have been symbolic. It would have been a direct challenge. Some investigators have wondered whether elements within the Union, perhaps aligned with outside interests, viewed Hoffa's ambitions as destabilizing. If that were true, the decision to remove him may have involved a broader coalition than originally assumed. But proving internal conspiracy has been difficult. The Union continued operating after Hoffa's disappearance. No document has surfaced indicating an official directive. No witness has provided conclusive testimony tying Union leadership to a murder plot. Still, the theory lingers. Then there is the question of trust. Hoffa was not a man easily intimidated. He would not have entered a stranger's car without reason. Most investigators believe he went willingly. That suggests he recognized whoever approached him in the parking lot. Perhaps it was someone he had known for years. Someone who reassured him. Someone who conveyed urgency. If so, the betrayal would have been intimate. A trusted intermediary may have convinced Hoffa that the meeting location had changed, that discussions would take place elsewhere. That time was short, and in that brief moment of decision, Hoffa may have believed he still controlled the outcome. Another theory concerns timing. Some former investigators have speculated that the plan may not have been to kill Hoffa immediately. Perhaps the intent was to pressure him, to force him to abandon his campaign. Perhaps events escalated unexpectedly. In high-stakes negotiations involving powerful men, tempers can flare. Calculations can shift, but most experts dismiss the idea of accident, the efficiency of the disappearance, the speed with which evidence vanished suggests preparation, planning, coordination. It suggests that once Hoffa entered that vehicle, the outcome had already been decided. There is also the theory of total destruction. Unlike many homicide cases, Hoffa's disappearance yielded no forensic trail, no confirmed bloodstains, no ballistic evidence, no gravesite. Some believe his body was transported to a location equipped to eliminate all physical remains, an industrial incinerator, perhaps. A facility capable of reducing evidence to ash within hours. If that is true, it would explain the decades of fruitless searching. It would also underscore the calculated nature of the crime. Over time, additional variations have emerged. Some suggest Hoffa may have been taken across state lines. Others propose he was buried temporarily and later relocated. A few speculate about secret burial sites, controlled by organized crime families that remain undisclosed even today. Yet, none of these theories have produced verifiable proof, and so we return to motive. Hoffa's greatest strength had always been his determination. He did not retreat easily. He did not accept limitations quietly. After his release from prison, he fought the restriction placed on his union involvement. He pressed for reinstatement. He sought meetings with powerful figures who could influence the outcome. To some, this persistence was admirable. To others, it was dangerous. In the calculus of organized power, there are moments when a single individual becomes too unpredictable to tolerate. If the order was given, it likely came from someone who believed the benefits outweighed the risks. Someone confident that silence could be maintained. Someone certain that loyalty or fear would keep participants from speaking. Nearly 50 years later, we are left with probability rather than certainty. Law enforcement agencies have repeatedly stated their belief that Hoffa was murdered by organized crime. Figures, but belief is not the same as closure. Perhaps the most unsettling theory is also the simplest. Jimmy Hoffa may have misjudged the moment, may have believed that his history, his reputation, his decades of influence still shielded him. He may have thought that negotiation was still possible, and in that assumption, he may have walked directly into the final chapter of his life. The camera lingers on the empty parking lot once more. The theories circle back to the same image. A man standing alone in the afternoon sun, waiting, somewhere between loyalty and ambition, between power and vulnerability. The decision was made. Who made it and why remains one of the most enduring questions in modern American history. And until evidence emerges from beyond rumor and recollection, the theories will continue to fill the silence left behind on July 30th, 1975. Nearly half a century has passed since Jimmy Hoffa disappeared. The world he once commanded has changed. Highways are wider. Trucking routes are tracked by satellites. Union membership across. America has declined from its mid-century peak. And yet, The name Hoffa endures. For many Americans who came of age in the 1950s and 1960s, Jimmy Hoffa represented something unmistakable, a force of will in an era when labor unions shaped the middle class. Under his leadership, the Teamsters secured national contracts that stabilized wages and benefits for hundreds of thousands of drivers. For families who depended on those paychecks, that stability was not abstract. It meant mortgages paid, children educated, retirement secured. Hoffa believed deeply in collective bargaining. He believed working men deserved leverage equal to the corporations they served. His methods were often confrontational. His rhetoric could be blunt, but his results were tangible. That is part of the legacy. The other part is more complicated. The investigations, the convictions, the allegations of organized crime influence, these remain inseparable from his story. Hoffa's life sits at the intersection of American labor triumph and American corruption anxiety. He was both admired and mistrusted, even today. Historians debate how to weigh those competing realities. Was he a champion who operated in a flawed system? Or a man who blurred lines too readily in pursuit of power? Perhaps he was both. The Teamsters Union continued after his disappearance. Leadership changed. Reforms were implemented over time. Federal oversight increased. The labor movement itself evolved. But Hoffa's absence became a permanent shadow dot in 1982. He was declared legally dead. There was no funeral in the traditional sense. No gravesite for supporters to visit. Instead, there was an empty space in American memory. The mystery of his disappearance gradually entered popular culture. Books were written. Documentaries produced. Feature films imagined the final hours. The story became a kind of modern folklore passed down in speculation, referenced in conversation, invoked as shorthand for vanishing without a trace. Yet beneath the mythology lies a family. Josephine Hoffa lived the remainder of her life without knowing precisely what happened to her husband. Children and grandchildren carried the weight of unanswered questions. For them, the mystery was not entertainment. It was personal. There is something uniquely unsettling about a disappearance without resolution. When a life ends in a known place, there is at least a point of mourning. When it ends in uncertainty, time does not close the door completely. Investigators have often said that the Hoffa case remains open, officially unsolved, technically active. But with each passing year, the likelihood of a courtroom reckoning diminishes. Many of the principal figure's suspected participants, possible witnesses, have died. Memories have faded. Physical evidence, if it ever existed, has likely deteriorated. And still, the question persists. What really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? It is tempting to believe that one day a final confession will surface, that a hidden document will be discovered, that an overlooked piece of land will yield remains. History, however, does not always grant tidy endings. Sometimes, it leaves us with ambiguity. In that ambiguity, Hoffa's life takes on a symbolic dimension. He rose from modest beginnings to challenge the most powerful institutions in America. He survived prosecution, imprisonment, and public scrutiny. He fought to reclaim his authority even when the odds were uncertain. And then, in a quiet suburban parking lot, he vanished. The contrast is striking. A man who once commanded national headlines disappeared in ordinary daylight. No dramatic chase. No final speech. No public reckoning. Just silence. Perhaps that is why the mystery endures. It touches on something deeper than organized crime or union politics. It speaks to the fragility of power, to the illusion of permanence. In America, we often believe that prominence guarantees visibility, that influence protects against erasure. Hoffa's disappearance challenges that assumption. Power can evaporate. Reputation can outlast presence. And sometimes, the most determined Individuals meet conclusions. They cannot negotiate. The camera returns to the site where the Machu's Red Fox once stood. The building is gone now. Businesses have changed. Traffic flows as it always has. No plaque marks the spot. Drivers pass without noticing. Yet beneath the routine of daily life lies a story that refuses to fade. Jimmy Hoffa left behind contracts and controversies. He left behind supporters who still credit him with improving their lives. He left behind critics who see his career as cautionary. And he left behind a question. Some men leave monuments. Some leave memoirs. Jimmy Hoffa left an absence. An empty parking space. An open case file. A chapter of American history that ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, until evidence emerges. From beyond rumor and recollection, the mystery will remain part of his legacy, a reminder that even in a nation built on documentation and record, some stories resist completion. So what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa?